So now we're at the 2 o'clock turn, starting with the Confederates, and General Beauregard sends out some verbal orders to B and Bartow's brigades to fall back to the area just south of Henry House Hill. They won't get the order for a half hour. Colonel Koch implements his orders to defend Farms Ford, and as a result, the A section of his brigade shifts to column and marches across the Holcomb's branch. Then Early receives his orders, and he begins to organize his men to move out. General Jones finally arrives at Newmarket with his infantry and a detachment of artillery from the Army of the Potomac, which is a Confederate group at this stage of the war. The artillery remains limbered because they're not where they're supposed to be destined yet. Then Elzey's brigade marches to Newmarket and the Washington Road with another detachment of cannon from the Army of the Shenandoah this time. And General Ewell marches with his brigade and artillery pieces across McLean's Ford towards the Union Mills Road. I really am not showing a whole lot of this in the picture here. But going to the Union term, I've got Hunter finally deciding to resume his attack. Remember, he stopped on a corps attack stoppage earlier, a division attack stoppage. So he's trying to capture Henry House Hill again, and he is including in his attack, the 2nd and 3rd divisions, and Colonel Franklin's 1st Brigade does move into contact with Barlow's brigade, and on the eastern side of the hill, Wilcox's 2nd Brigade encounters Jackson's men on the western side, and then the 3rd Division's artillery is unlimbered on Dogan's Ridge. You can see that in the picture on the left, and then Colonel Howard's brigade deploys in reserve at the Stone House, which you can also see with the leader there at the crossroads in the picture, and that's where Colonel Heiselman sets up his headquarters. And then you can see also on the left-hand side of the picture, the 2nd Division's artillery, which is limbered, gets on to Dogan's Ridge either. They're taking this high ground here, so they have a good line of sight. And then Colonel Hunter and his division advance to Buck Hill. You can see them in the picture on Buck Hill on the left side of the picture. And they're joining Heinzelman's forces there. Now, this picture is showing when the combat happens, the rebels open up with defensive fire from Henry House Hill, and Franklin's brigade ends up taking some straggler losses, and he becomes shaken and they fall back. Franklin's brigade has a D morale rating, so this sort of thing's going to happen a lot when he gets hit. Wilcox's brigade also suffers a straggler loss and becomes shaken. And Jackson's brigade suffers some casualties during the Union offensive fire. And as is expected, Franklin becomes low on small arms, but he inflicts enough hits to cause a bunch of losses to Bartow's brigade, and it wrecks the unit. And the rebel brigade ends up becoming shaken and then falls back. And that brings an end to the 2 o'clock turn. Next, we go to the 2:30 turn, and General B and Colonel Bartow's brigades receive their orders to fall back, and they do fall back to Bald Hill immediately, while the commander of B's brigade attempts to reorganize. Colonel Cox, the A part of his brigade, advances to the vicinity of Farms Ford, where his men change into line formation. And then I was also able to unlimber the artillery at Newmarket. And General Ewell's brigade and his artillery detachment are continuing in the march along the Union Mills Road. Then just north of Henry House Hill, the Union infantry resumes defensive fire, and Jackson's brigade ends up taking heavy losses, but he passes his morale check, and I'll just add that Jackson's brigade has an A morale rating, so it's a pretty hardy brigade. And then the Union artillery on Dogan's Ridge, which you can see at the bottom of the picture here, fires, but it doesn't have any effect. And then Jackson uses offensive fire, and even though he's low ammo and has some penalties because of this, but he does fire. And the artillery on Henry House Hill also fires at Wilcox's brigade, and this leaves Wilcox's unit wrecked. It becomes shaken as well. Then we go to the Union part of the turn. Colonel Wilcox ends up ordering his men to fall back across Young's Branch to recuperate, while Colonel Howard orders his men forward. In addition, I have the 2nd Artillery unlimbering on Dogan's Ridge, and you can see on the picture now the 2nd Division artillery is shown as unlimbered. And also on the Union left, Colonel Hunter's 2nd Division is returned to action, and Porter's brigade marches right into contact with General Jackson's right. And McDowell rides off the scene here toward Poplar Ford. So then the defensive fire kicks in. General Jackson's brigade fires on Heinzelman's division, and Howard's brigade suffers some casualties, but he holds his ground. Then Franklin and Howard both return fire with the support of the Union artillery guns on Dogan's Ridge, and Jackson's right extended lines, which you can see in the picture, suffer some casualties. And then in further combat, Jackson's brigade becomes shaken, but has no further losses. And that brings the 2:30 turn to a close. Now we go to the 3 o'clock turn, and General Beauregard sends another verbal order to Colonel Koch to maneuver the A part of his brigade from Farms Ford to the Anderson Place and then attack the Union left at the Stone House. He won't get this order for an hour while the courier is riding out to give this verbal order. Also, General Ewell's brigade moves along the Union Mills Road, where it becomes alert to enemy troops from Baron von Steinwehr's brigade. So Ewell stops and he deploys his men in line formation under the cover of the forests there. I don't believe I have this in the picture. But on Henry House Hill, the Union commanders end up firing defensive fire at Jackson's brigade, and Jackson suffers some heavy losses and becomes shaken. However, he holds a position. Being an A-rated unit, that's not surprising. There's more defensive fire. The Union hits the center of Jackson's line, but it has no effect. And one of the Union brigades that was firing upslope, so there's a penalty for that. And another one was low on ammo. There's a penalty for that. So these are just negative shifts on the fire table. And then General Jackson orders his men to resume fire on the 3rd Division, and Howard's brigade ends up suffering casualties and becomes shaken. Then we go to the Union part of the turn. General McDowell rides forward along the Spindle Trail, and he meets up with General Tyler. So the 1-4 brigade appears from the east. It has orders that he comes in with to march to Centerville. So Colonel Montgomery marches into the little town. Then Porter and Franklin move back into contact with Jackson's brigade on Henry House Hill, and the rebels open up defensive fire on the advancing Union troops. So as a result, Howard's brigade takes 2 straggler losses and becomes disorganized and ends up having to fall back several hundred yards. Franklin's brigade also suffers heavy losses as Jackson's brigade becomes low ammo from expending so much on Franklin. And then Porter's brigade is shaken in the face of rebel artillery fire, and he's forced to fall back. So this isn't going too well. The 2nd and 3rd Division's artillery, though, strike. You can see them in the picture on Dogan's Ridge or Dogan's Hill, and they hit Jackson's left, and it forces a morale check, which is easily passed. And then Franklin attacks the Confederate center at Henry House, and Jackson's brigade is forced to make another morale check, again being an A-rated unit, not surprising, he passes. And then Colonel Porter orders his units, which are split into two groups, to fire on Jackson's right extended lines, and it has no effect, and Jackson's men take a solid stand. That ends the 3 o'clock turn. So we go to the 3:30 turn. Beauregard is ordering General Jones to march with his brigade to Chin Ridge and hit the Union right along Young's Branch. And then he sends a second order to Elzey to move his brigade toward the Robinson home and attack the Union left along the creek. But these orders are not going to be there till 4 o'clock, so we'll have to wait and see what happens. And General Early, he has his orders, but he doesn't budge. He fails his delay reduction roll. So, he's still planning what he's going to do is what that symbolizes. And then in the picture here, you can see along the Union Mills Road, General Ewell's brigade ends up into contact with Colonel von Steinwehr's brigade. And the Union fires some defensive fire here, but the Confederate troops do suffer some casualties and some stragglers, but they return fire, and Ewell's men, completely obliterates von Steinwehr's weak unit. Then back at Henry House, the Union has some defensive fire. Franklin is low on ammunition, but he's going to fire with the penalties, and as expected, it has no effect. The artillery, though, that are on Dogan's Ridge fires at Jackson's left, and this has no effect. And then Colonel Porter's brigade attacks the right flank, right into the heart of Jackson's wing, and Jackson has to take a morale check. He passes, and then returns offensive fire from his small arms and his artillery, and as a result, Franklin's brigade loses some men to stragglers, and Porter's brigade also takes some further casualties. During the Union portion of the 3:30 turn, General McDowell sends orders to Miles to fall back to Centerville with his division. Again, this order is not going to arrive for a full hour till 4:30 p.m. In the meantime, Colonel Howard orders his men to advance on the western side of Henry House. The Union troops there are exposed to rebel defensive fire, so Howard's brigade continues to absorb this, and it does stand. Franklin's brigade loses some more men to stragglers, and he becomes shaken, but remains in his position. And then Porter's brigade is hit on the right, and he takes heavy losses. His brigade becomes shaken, and he has to retreat. And I'll say this was lucky for the rebels, because Porter was about to strike Jackson's extended line in a flank attack, and that wouldn't have been pretty. So good on the defensive fire here. Colonel Howard does lead his men into an attack on Jackson's left flank. Jackson does suffer some losses, but the attack on the center has no effect, and Colonel Porter's men fire on the rebels' right flank, and Jackson does suffer some heavy losses here, and this time his brigade does become wrecked. But that brings the 3:30 turn to a close, and thank you for watching, and I hope you have a great day.